Welcome, everyone. We're just going to give everybody a minute to join us. Okay, and welcome to today's webinar, Protection Practices and Emergencies. This session is part of Prepared Together, Canadian Red Cross Disaster Preparedness Virtual Learning Series. Today's session is presented in English. Over the spring and summer of 2024 are predicted to bring an unprecedented level of intensity for emergencies across the country. The goal of the Canadian Red Cross Disaster Preparedness Series is to support people and communities to prepare for, increase their resilience to, and respond to future disasters. We are hosting learning sessions throughout the summer in both English and French. You can use the QR code on your screen to visit our website to learn more about and register for other programming. We will also be putting the links in the chat for you. There it is. Right. And just a few housekeeping items before we begin. Today's webinar will be recorded and recordings will be sent to all registrants. Closed captioning is also available in both English and French. Just click the closed captioning button in your Zoom control panel. At the end of today's session, we will have a Q&A period. So please leave your questions in the Q&A box in the control panel at the bottom of your screen. We will be interacting with the facilitators today using the chat box as well, but to ensure that your questions get answered, please use the Q&A box. There will be a feedback survey that launches on your browser once you exit today's webinar, and we would really appreciate your input on how we did today. Resource packages from all of our sessions in this series will also be available on the CRC website this summer. The slide deck will also be included in our webpage as well. Any questions about today's programming, you can email us at rrr@redcross.ca. And we invite you to please enter in the chat where you are joining us from today and the land on which you reside. Thank you. The International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies has seen fundamental principles, which we also honor in Canada. Interestingly, these principles align with Indigenous peoples of Canada's 7 sacred teachings. Where I reside on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe peoples, these are also known as the grandfather teachings of wisdom, love, respect, bravery, honesty, humility, and truth. Thank you, everyone, for entering where you are joining us from today in your territory. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to welcome Michelle and Sonia to our presentation today. And as our facilitators, I'm looking forward to the presentation. Thanks so much, Michelle and Sonia.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, April, so much. Hello, everyone, and welcome. And very happy that you all could take some time out of your day to join us for the presentation today. So we're just going to review a bit of an agenda for today. So I'm just going to hold for the PowerPoint to catch up. Okay. So here are the objectives for today's session. We want to raise awareness of protection and emergencies, recognizing that protection occurs and occurs more frequently in emergencies and crises. We'll look into why it's important to address protection concerns, and we'll share some lessons learned, tips, and tools that we use to mitigate, address, and manage protection from Red Cross's perspective. And then, as April mentioned, we will have some time for questions at the end of the session. So just to help set the stage for us today, I'm going to read a scenario. And as I'm going through the scenario, I'd like to invite you to imagine what experiencing a disaster or crisis might feel like. In the aftermath of a disaster, your community is forced to evacuate, leaving behind their homes, memories, and sense of normalcy. In the shelters where they seek safety, a diverse array of individuals and families find themselves confronting not only the physical devastation, but also the invisible wounds inflicted upon their mental well-being. People are confused about when they'll be able to go home or how long they'll have to sleep in either a hotel room or a cot in an unfamiliar community center. Among the displaced are elderly individuals who may feel particularly vulnerable and disoriented in unfamiliar surroundings, children who aren't quite sure why everyone had to leave, and Indigenous community members who once again are separated from their ancestral lands and cultural supports, compounding their sense of loss and displacement. Families striving to shield their children from the trauma while coping with their own overwhelming emotions grapple with the challenge of providing comfort and stability amidst uncertainty. The psychological toll of the disaster manifests in heightened levels of anxiety, depression, frustration, and even anger as individuals struggle to make sense of the upheaval and loss they have experienced. Parents with infants are not sure where to buy formula in this new location and are feeling extremely worried about keeping their little ones safe. And an elderly woman without family or her support network is struggling to cope with the unknown state of her home. Moreover, vulnerabilities and increased risks, such as the potential for exploitation, abuse, and further trauma, need to be managed delicately amidst the chaos and uncertainty of this new place. The need for mental health and psychosocial support services and protection of the vulnerable community members becomes increasingly evident as the community copes and waits, not knowing when they will be able to return home or if they'll have a home to return to. So we'll just take a moment to pause and reflect. As you keep this scenario in mind, I'd like to invite you to answer the question, what supports would help you manage this situation most effectively? Please feel free to put your answers in the chat. Okay, so Dwayne mentions ESS, emergency social supports. Yes, other NGOs, so other non-governmental organizations or partner agencies that are often working alongside us to offer supports to the impacted individuals. Critical incident stress management teams. Thank you for that, Daniel. Just maybe wait for a couple of more and then we'll move on. Okay, so what can we do to reduce mental health and protection risks and to make the experience more tolerable for everyone? Well, we start by recognizing that different individuals, families, and communities will have different needs, and we take these diversity needs into account in all phases of our responses and operations. We also recognize that individuals' mental health and emotional well-being will be strained and that individuals feel and experience stress and deal with it in different ways. And we're also aware that protection risks are always present in our communities and that they often increase during a crisis. So ultimately taking a proactive approach that anticipates, mitigates, and addresses mental health and protection concerns makes the response more stable and safe for everyone. So what is protection? So in simplest terms, protection is about keeping people safe from harm. We recognize that every individual has the right to safety and protection from violence, abuse, and harm, and we align our processes with relevant provincial and federal legislation to help us ensure protection for all. However, protection is not just about legislation and reporting to the authorities, but also about ensuring that we connect individuals to appropriate supports at a time when they need them the most. So this definition of protection is from the International Federation of the Red Cross and offers a framework for protection that's also adopted by the Canadian Red Cross. Protection encompasses all activities that uphold the rights of individuals by preserving the physical, psychological, and emotional safety, integrity, and dignity of those who are at risk of or affected by violence, discrimination, and exclusion. So just the time for another poll, a bit of a brainstorm. So once again, I'd like to invite you just to answer the question, what are some types of protection issues or incidents that might occur or you may encounter during an emergency? So please go ahead and put your answers in the chat. So what types of situations do you think might happen or take place during an emergency in a response? Families could get separated, yes. Separation of families, most definitely. Security for individuals and staff not present, yes. So let's say security and safety issues. Verbal outbursts, definitely. Okay. Elderly people could be left out of decisions. Great point, Farah. Children alone. Yep. Okay, so feel free to keep adding your answers to the chat and we'll just continue. So the next couple of slides offer some examples of protection concerns. This is definitely not an exhaustive list of concerns. However, these are some of the types of protection issues we see encounter in our operations and responses. So there's domestic violence, missing persons, substance use and overdose, child and adult abuse and neglect, suicidal ideation. We also have sexual and gender-based violence, unaccompanied and unattended children or minors. There's risks of human trafficking, interpersonal violence, mental health emergencies, and gang recruitments. Once again, this is not an exhaustive list of concerns, but definitely some examples of types of protection that we have managed and encountered during our responses. So some of the lessons learned for Red Cross and protection, gender inclusion, and engagement when it comes to the importance of protection in emergencies is that we support a broad range of people and communities experiencing crises, disasters, and conflicts, often at a large scale. We also know that violence, abuse, and other protection concerns are prevalent all the time across Canada, and these concerns often increase during emergencies. And during evacuations and sheltering responses, there can be high rates of child protection incidents, sexual violence, gang, or risks of trafficking violence. So when it comes to violence in emergencies or crises, there is overwhelming evidence, both domestically and internationally, to indicate that all types of violence are exacerbated by crisis and disasters. There are a number of contributing and intersecting factors, not all of which are captured in this image. But what we do know is that in a crisis and disaster, both formal and informal protective systems often collapse or are inaccessible or unavailable. We also know that as individuals and collective stress increases, some individuals resort to harmful coping mechanisms such as use of alcohol and drugs. There is also overcrowding, such as a whole family sharing a hotel room for weeks on time without typical routine and activities that would also act as a buffer and bit of a protective mechanism for the family members. It is also important to highlight that some individuals were already facing exclusion and marginalization prior to the emergency, and these are often exacerbated and compounded further by the disaster. Once again, it is a combination of these and other factors that lead to an increase in violence in crisis or disasters, and evidence shows that there is an increased risk of violence ranging anywhere from 6% to over 300% following a disaster or emergency. So why does protection matter? By having clear processes and approaches from the start, we can ensure that adequate measures are already in place to ensure everyone's safety and well-being, and that personnel know what to do if and when they encounter protection situations. It is also important to highlight that historical trauma and harm should be considered and integrated with our approaches. And we see this especially when we're supporting and working with Indigenous communities. We also want to highlight that for some individuals, emergencies can present opportunities to connect with and access life-changing supports, sometimes for the very first time. And it is also important to note that when protection concerns are appropriately managed and addressed, this allows individuals to recover better from the impacts of the disaster or emergency event in the long term. And I believe I will pass it to Michelle at this point.
Thank you so much, Sonia. And thanks everyone for all of your engagement in our session so far. So I'm going to take over and talk more about the Canadian Red Cross approach to protection, and more practically speaking, how we as an organization seek to mitigate and, as Sonia mentioned earlier, to address protection concerns. We want to make sure that we're able to enable our own personnel and workforce to understand protection risks, and also to know what to do if something were to happen. And as mentioned earlier, this does help to stabilize and ensure safety across our operations. So our approach to protection is really situated on 4 pillars, and these are dignity, access, participation, and safety. So dignity is very crucial. This underscores the need to respect, safeguard, and promote the dignity of everyone, and making sure that their well-being and privacy and other cultural needs are met. So think about that situation at the beginning of the session. If you were in that community member's shoes, you would want to be treated with dignity and respect when you're receiving services. So how can we make sure that that's really integrated well into all of our service delivery? We also want to make sure that our services are accessible to all. So that includes accessible for people with disabilities, that they're accessible for people of different social or economic backgrounds, and that information is readily accessible as well. Participation is another core part of our approach, and this involves the meaningful engagement of community members. So really trying to understand what would suit community members' needs the most, what's most appropriate and safe for them. So making sure that they have a voice in some way in how they're accessing services. And then finally, safety, which is very core to protection. This is really about making sure that everyone's individual physical, mental, and psychological safety is respected, and that we're able to either mitigate safety risks and address them as soon as possible. So we'll get into that in a bit more detail now. Now, earlier we saw a number of different types of protection incidents, examples of what protection could look like. And you saw things like domestic violence, child abuse, risks of trafficking, abuse of elders or seniors. So these are some of the different types of protection incidents we can encounter in one of our operations or response, and frankly, a type of protection issue that anyone could encounter at any time. For the Canadian Red Cross, we've categorized loosely these types of protection incidents into 4 key areas, and that helps us in our decision-making process if we were to encounter a protection concern. So we have child protection, which is basically involves any protection incident that includes a minor, so under the age of majority. And this varies slightly province to province, but we do have that legal obligation from provincial and federal and territorial legislation to make sure that we are addressing child protection. We do have that obligation to report and to make sure that children are safe because they are dependent on adults for receiving services. We really have to pay special attention to the well-being of children. We also have adult protection, which involves any of those protection risks you saw earlier, but just only involving adults. We also have emergency situations. So these can include some medical emergencies related to the protection issues you saw earlier. For example, sexual and gender-based violence that requires emergency health intervention. But it can also include other acute mental health crises. So suicidal ideation is considered an emergency situation. For us, we want to make sure that that individual or community member is receiving urgent support if we hear any disclosures to us about people feeling or having some suicidal ideation. And then finally, a breach of the code of conduct, which is very important for us and for other organizations who are involved with the public. We always want to make sure that we take that very seriously, and we do have a full investigation process for that at the Canadian Red Cross. I'll go through now just some of our protection tools, just to help situate it a bit more for all of you in terms of how we actually implement protection tools. How do we actually mitigate protection concerns? So we'll go through some tools and then look at a case study. So at the Canadian Red Cross, some of our protection tools include an assessment. So this is a protection assessment that we conduct at the beginning of every operation. So we have a group of highly trained individuals who will be able to do this assessment. And this looks at different factors of a site, for example, an evacuation site, or it could be the site of any of our service delivery points. And this is where we are engaging directly with the public. So we want to make sure we have an assessment done to identify any risks and make sure that we can make recommendations in real time. We also conduct trainings and briefings for all of our personnel and for partner agencies. And the trainings and briefings can be around protection issues. They can be around trends that we've seen, maybe in that location. And we can really also inform everyone about what the processes are or best approaches for addressing protection concerns, for example, what to do, who to call, and how to escalate. Other tools that we have include our step-by-step process for addressing protection. So we call this the protection protocol. It's a 5-step process for all of our personnel that tells them what to do if a protection concern occurs. And this has been very useful for us as an organization because it allows everyone who's working on site, whether they're volunteers, partner agencies, or our own staff, to be very clear about what to do. Because you saw with the protection examples, they can be very serious issues that people don't have a lot of experience with. So the protocols are there so people have a very clear guiding document of what to do when they feel much more empowered to make decisions in the moment. So those protocols have been very helpful for us, and they allow us to take that step-by-step approach and make sure that we are making the right decisions in the right way and safely providing referrals for those individuals. So finally, one of the protection tools I wanted to highlight are the referral pathways and community resources that the Canadian Red Cross compiles and we update very regularly. So referral pathways are a very key tool for us, as you heard Sonia talk about earlier. For the Canadian Red Cross, although we interact with the public at a very large scale across the country and often thousands of people at a time, we won't have a very long-term connection with people often. So we always want to make sure that if people experience a protection concern, we can connect them to the right resource and the long-term resources that would be best suited for them. So our referrals are very important, and we always want to make sure that they're up to date and that we have a good variety of appropriate referrals for everyone who's experiencing protection concerns. So I'll situate all of this in one example, and this is when the Canadian Red Cross supported the Ukrainians who were arriving in Canada following the crisis in 2022. So many of you know that we welcomed a number of Ukrainians into Canada at most of our major airports. And to support this operation, knowing that there was a lot of risks around new populations coming into Canada, people who might not speak the language, and mostly women and children, we wanted to make sure that we were able to proactively take that protection approach. So one of the first things that we did, as I mentioned before, were those assessments. So we had both a psychosocial support assessment and a protection assessment that we conducted. And that was done at every airport location, recognizing that the airports were different. We wanted to make sure that we had safe spaces and quiet spaces to be able to have sensitive conversations with different families and individuals. So we wanted to make sure we could identify all of those different factors for those sites. We also wanted to steward safe and supportive environments. So this was really important for us to do. It's part of the more holistic approach that we take. So this involved both developing communications, so for all of our personnel, but also for the people arriving from Ukraine. It was sort of a welcome package that let them know what services they were able to access. So again, talking about that accessibility, how they were able to connect with us and engage with us more so on the participation side, and also some of the resources, the referrals, if they needed anything. So if they didn't feel comfortable asking us for resources, they already had that available to them. We also made sure that we implemented that protection protocol. So we had a specific protocol for all of those different sites so that everyone knew which steps to take, again, at the airport if we were to hear a disclosure from community members. And then we were able to provide guidance to our senior leadership at the site about protection issues. And that included providing briefings on things like risks of human trafficking, which was a much higher risk for this population, unfortunately. So another way that we supported was through direct support to those impacted. And this means our team on the ground, the mental health and psychosocial support team, along with our protection specialists, were able to provide face-to-face support to those arriving from Ukraine. So we were able to support people with complex needs. For example, sometimes during registration, a family or an individual may disclose that they're worried about violence, either domestic violence or maybe violence from others. So we did have some of that come up in our operations. So we're able to respond to that immediately with referrals and to assess immediate safety. So those are things we were able to do. We were also able to provide those mental health resources to the people who were impacted. We had a coping with crisis pamphlet, for example, that we were able to distribute to everyone who arrived at the airport. And some people needed to stay at an airport hotel for a certain period of time as well. So we had a bit more engagement with them to make sure that they were well supported and safe. And then we could and did make referrals to external agencies. So we were able to engage directly with other community actors. So that leads me to the next part of our support. So community engagement and mobilization was really important because in this operation and in most of our operations, frankly, we do coordinate with other partners and external agencies. This is not just one organization's effort, it's an effort of many. So making sure that we're connecting with the right external agencies, for example, other mental health providers, there were other Ukrainian diaspora organizations that we were able to connect with as well. Women's shelters and other crisis lines. We connect with them to let them know that, okay, there is this crisis or we're providing this level of support. We may be calling you with additional requests or with additional referrals. So those are things that are really important so that we can make sure everyone's on the same page and we can better coordinate resources. And then we also, from our side, were able to support the health, safety, and wellness of our own personnel and volunteers. So that included just providing some group skills sessions to our personnel. So in addition to those briefings on protection, talking about cultural awareness, for example, talking about the risks of human trafficking, what to do if you're feeling like you might be identifying some of those risks, and then as well, some group sessions on personal and self-care and well-being, knowing that our volunteers and field staff were really engaging with people on that day-to-day basis, and we're maybe hearing a lot of stories of fleeing war and violence, as well as some of the other the protection issues that may have come up, for example, with family violence. So we wanted to make sure that our personnel also felt very well prepared and that we were able to continually have that engagement with them so that they could be well. So that's a snapshot of one of our operations, a big operation, Pan-Canada operation that we had. But we have a lot of experience now, of course, with a number of different types of operations. So evacuations for wildfires and floods, other types of weather events, critical infrastructure damage. We've supported evacuations for that, as well as other health interventions. So from all of those operations, we have learned a lot of lessons. So I wanted to share some of them with you all here that are a bit more practical. And if you're with an organization that works in this area, something that you might be able to take back. So from the data that we've been collecting over the past several years, we've seen that the majority of protection incidents that we encounter in our work do involve things like domestic violence or intimate partner violence. So around 50% of our protection concerns involve that type of incident, as well as child protection concerns. So those are the two most frequent types of protection incidents we encounter. And that tracks with data from Canadian statistics as well, in terms of domestic violence being fairly prevalent in terms of what you'd see when engaging with families and the general public. However, it does increase, as Sonia mentioned earlier, during emergencies. So something that we want to pay particular attention to, especially in those shelter operations. Also, the importance of supporting children and making sure that our personnel, whether it's staff or volunteers or partners, understand the importance of child protection and how to escalate those risks. So we do make sure that we have a child protection is included in our briefings, including which agency is the correct agency to make any reports to. We've mentioned earlier, but we've seen that anytime we're supporting a population in a shelter or accommodation type of response, there are likely to be higher risks of protection concerns. And that, I think, comes from the fact that you're supporting people more on a 24/7 type of basis. So you'll either witness or hear more disclosures just based on that level of engagement. And then we've also seen that serious mental health concerns such as suicidal ideation do increase during operations, during responses as well in crises. So training and capacity building for personnel is a really core part of what we do. And this is really on the prevention side, because if our teams are able to better identify and respond to protection concerns, then we can make decisions more effectively and more quickly, and that leads to safety for everyone. So we have been really focused on building capacity across our teams and with our partners. So that includes how to manage or report protection incidents. This is something that you might want to take back to either your community or your organization. Think about what that process might look like so that protection issues could be best addressed. And also, we proactively train teams on those protocols. So making sure that before the disaster happens, everyone already has a good level of understanding, rather than trying to have all that training happen right at the outset of a disaster when there's a lot of competing decisions and needs from the community members. And then also ensuring that we have the systems in place so that protection incidents can be actioned quite quickly. I mentioned referrals and community partners, and I'll just go back to this again because it is so key. It's always good to know which other agencies are in the location or maybe in the region that you work, so that you can call out to them if you need additional support. We're not experts on everything, so this is why it's important to make sure we're connected with those experts for certain issues. They can provide that long-term support, really make that path to recovery much better and more effective for someone. So having that updated list of referral agencies is essential. And here are some things to keep in mind. So community mapping is something that can be really helpful. In some places, if you're not familiar with, let's say, what resources exist, and let's say you're going to a community, the community members might be able to help you identify who they trust, who they've been using before. So this could be, let's say, a substance use or addictions counseling organization. It could be certain crisis lines that are trusted by the community. So knowing what the community members already trust is a really good way to start mapping some of those agencies. We also have something called a quick list. So it's not the most robust list, which we do also have, but for that early stages of an emergency, just a short list of, let's say, about 5 or so agencies that are very low barrier. So let's say free to the public and that are accessible to all. So those are things that everyone can use, something like a 211 or crisis lines, the 988 suicide prevention line, for example. Those are good resources to always have on hand. And you always want to make sure that the hours and the cost and locations are accurate and up to date. So keep that in mind as well. Then also keep in mind on-site or off-site resources. So sometimes organizations and agencies might be able to send people to a site where a community, let's say, is evacuated. But there might be virtual supports, there might be other off-site locations, so you can have a blend of both of those. child protection, as I mentioned before, is particularly important to consider. We do have those obligations under federal and provincial or territorial legislation. And this is always in the best interest of the child to really ensure their safety. So if we suspect or observe any child protection issue, we do have that obligation to report. And so it's important and very helpful to know which child protection agency your team should call. And that should be done as soon as possible. So there will be different types of agencies in each province or territory. So there could be a delegated Indigenous child protection agency, or there could be child protection agencies at more the municipal level, or there could be a provincial level line. So it's good to keep that in mind and try to map that out ahead of any emergency response. So we went over what child abuse could include. I'll just repeat it again. So emotional, physical, sexual abuse, or neglect and exploitation. So if there's any suspicions of that happening, we want to make sure we can act immediately so that that child is safe. The differences in age, the age of majority, it does differ across different provinces. So keep that in mind too. And again, we do have that obligation to report. So it's something that our team does with CRC is we help to map all of these pieces of information out for them and have that ready to go before before a response happens. And so some final takeaways are mitigating protection concerns wherever possible. So it's not likely that we're going to prevent every type of protection concern, but we can try to mitigate some. So here are some tips that could help with that. So for example, during a service delivery, or let's say it's a registration, privacy can go a long way to help people feel comfortable just talking to you and maybe sharing something that they're concerned with. So if they have that privacy, the ability to maybe, without being in earshot of a lot of other people, they might say, you know, I'm not feeling safe being in the room with this person. Or they might say, you know, I'm worried about what someone said to me outside today, and I'm worried about violence happening, or, you know, I'm worried about my own mental health. So privacy can really help people to feel more comfortable to share any of those risks. And it's really important to make sure that there are those avenues for people to share, because that's often where you will hear about protection concerns. And for accommodations or shelters, one thing that's been very helpful for us is to have a spare room available. And this is at a hotel site, or even having a separate space if it's a congregate shelter. This really helps so that if you do need to separate individuals or a family, let's say, due to violence or escalating tensions, you're able to have a safe room or a spare room available and ready to go if that should happen. And this also allows people to, let's say, after a certain point in time, they can maybe request to be in a separate room because they're worried about that happening. So that's a practical tip that we've seen be very effective for our operations. For large families in hotels, we've also made some accommodations so that there can be 2 rooms, but they're adjoining. That way you reduce the overcrowding in rooms, and there's enough connection still so the family feels together, but they do have a bit more space between them. That's something to also consider. Child-friendly spaces certainly help to alleviate stress for families and parents. So this can even be just a simple temporary area during registration where we have some toys and coloring books for children. So the parents can go and register and talk to the Red Cross while, you know, kids are occupied, and they're able to kind of have their own fun and play at the same time. So that's something that we found very helpful. Disability access, and it is also very crucial to consider. In Canada, we do have some legislation and regulations that support this. However, be mindful of different sites and think of what might become a barrier. So for example, if someone's using a mobility device or a mobility aid that might not be suitable for them to have a room or a hotel room, let's say, that isn't accessible. So we have to make sure we're pairing that appropriately. Also think of how someone would be able to access food and access other recreation supports if they do have disabilities. And then there are many other actions. So I invite you to also think of in the chat, what are some actions that you think could be taken as well, or that maybe you've used in your own organization or in your own life. So we're going to go back to the poll. So I wanted to ask all of you and invite you to share, even if it hasn't happened yet, hypothetically, what would be helpful to you or your organization to prevent and address protection concerns? And it could be something that we've already mentioned if that resonated for you. But you can think of either yourself individually, what might help you to help other family members, or what could help your organization. Yep, I see family linkages. Absolutely. Making sure that families aren't, families can be together. And so if we have, let's say, separate hotels for a big evacuation, we try to make sure that families are together. Absolutely. Yeah, the all hazard emergency plans and including all hazards, including that lens with protection. I think making sure that we're able to integrate these protection practices into any type of emergency plan. So that's a good one. Having a resource guide readily available. Yeah, really helpful to have that for the personnel and for the people we're serving. Okay, great. Well, I really encourage you to share some questions in the chat. I know I saw one just earlier that we'll get to, but we very much welcome all of your questions and all of your comments. So if you have other tips or other practices that you would recommend, we absolutely would love to hear them. And your questions we look forward to getting to as well. So before we move on to the questions, I wanted to just share some national resources that are barrier-free. So these are things that you can take away with you. So things like Kids Help Phone Line. This is really a great resource for children. They can either text or call and receive that support. It's a great resource. The National Suicide Crisis Hotline is another one. Hope for Wellness Helpline. So this is support for Indigenous communities. Women's shelters, and there's a list, locations and contact information for all the women's shelters in Canada through sheltersafe.ca. The iHeal app, which is a free and private secure app to help Canadian women who've experienced abuse to find ways to stay safe and be well. So that's another important one. The Canadian Human Trafficking Hotline. So that's one as well for people who are experiencing that, are looking to exit, or people who have family members that they're concerned with. And then 211 is a great resource for to connect to all social services in the area. So this is at the provincial level. All right. Thank you, everyone, so much. We really do value all of your insight. So we're very excited to get to the Q&A portion of this now, too.
All right, thank you, Michelle and Sonia, for that presentation. Really informative. And we will be sending a recording to all registrants today of the session. And when you close your browser today, there will be a feedback survey. And we really value your feedback on how we did today. So please just take a couple minutes to fill that out once you exit the webinar. And our next session is actually tomorrow. So we encourage you to sign up for that as well. On psychological first aid at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard, 12 p.m. Mountain Time. So I invite Michelle and Sonia to come back on the screen and let's get to the Q&A. So I'm just checking the box and I'm seeing we don't have any questions in the box, but there are a bunch in the chat. So we can I'm just going to scroll up in the chat box here. And so Daniel asked about post-emergency mental health support. What timeline does CRC use to bring in mental health support? There is a timeline difference between bringing in support too early, so survivors still very distraught and angry, and bringing in support too late, raising the question of why was support not here earlier?
Yeah, it's a great question, Daniel. What CRC does typically is we will have mental health and psychosocial support personnel on site. Our recommendation is to have them on site at all times. They might not be providing direct, and they don't provide clinical support, but they might be providing that mental health, wellness, psychosocial support on an ongoing basis, having wellness checks with just community members. So it's not usually just one point of intervention. That group of personnel is there on the site throughout the service delivery. So let's say in an evacuation and people are evacuated for 3 weeks, we would aim to have our personnel, mental health and psychosocial support personnel on site for the duration of that time. So there might be some escalations throughout those 3 weeks across different community members, and our team is there to provide that support. So based on their knowledge of the situation, they can essentially try to mitigate any escalations, as you said, so not coming in too late. And also just helping to have supportive conversations if people are still distraught and angry, like you said. So they're kind of there always just to help with people. It could be something minor, it could escalate to something bigger, but our personnel are there to try to help provide that support.
Great. Thank you, Michelle.
And if I can even just add to that, if that's okay, all of our personnel, and this even goes to responders who do the registration. So all our personnel are trained in psychological first aid as well. And I know that Michelle talked about the importance of all personnel being trained before the disaster happens. So definitely psychological first aid also goes a long way in identifying crisis sort of before, or situations before they escalate and before they become a crisis. And then also just in terms of referrals and clinical supports and mental health supports. Another important aspect, and I believe this was mentioned earlier, is that we do try whenever possible to connect individuals to community supports. We don't want to create dependency on the Red Cross because we recognize that we're not staying there long term. So we definitely want to empower the individual and the community. So we will connect them to community resources as well.
Thank you, Sonia. Dwayne asks, what are CRC's thresholds? So if there's a building fire and there are family members displaced, what happens? 54 displaced, similar types of emergencies. How many people can you typically support on short notice?
It's a great question, Dwayne. I'll take the first go at this. So our emergency management colleagues, we do have a full system and a lot of pre-existing agreements in place with municipalities and provinces and territories to address just that. So there is a threshold number of when is CRC activated, but the Canadian Red Cross does support even personal house fires. Let's say one person is displaced from a house fire. Our volunteers would be supporting that individual. So let's say fire department and police are called, they would call the Canadian Red Cross volunteers as well to come and provide some of that support to that family or individual. So it could be as small as one individual or family. And then we would be activated at a larger scale if it's, let's say, an apartment fire. And then an even larger scale, we have a level 1 to 5 scale. Household fire would be level 1 up to a level 5, which is the sort of critical Pan-Canada incident. So based on that scale, we have different activation mechanisms. So different numbers of personnel would be activated, both a blend of volunteers and staff.
Dwayne says thanks. I'm wondering if there are any more questions from anybody in the audience. And if not, I think we can wrap up for today. So thank you so much, Michelle and Sonia, for sharing your knowledge with us today, and looking forward to more sessions in the future. Thank you everyone for joining. Take care, everybody.